Well, first I want to thank Meteor for having me and letting me give this talk. And I'll introduce myself in a second, but I just want to get a sense of who I'm talking to. So while you're eating, if you could entertain me, and just raise your hand if you've never, if this year is the first time you've written a web application. Can you raise your hand? Okay, so this is unfortunate for me. I would do better if everyone was a beginner. Okay, so how about people who have been writing web applications for at least 5 years? Okay. What about Meteor? How many people have been using Meteor for more than a couple months? Okay, so it's a pretty advanced audience. Rails, what about Rails? A lot of Rails people? What about Django? Okay, all right. All right, any PhDs in computer science? All right. I'm glad. I was going to ask you to leave, and that would have been uncomfortable. And so I'm glad there's no PhDs in computer science. So let me just tell you a little bit about myself and kind of what I plan to do. So I run this website called Invented Mind. You might have seen it. It's basically a bunch of tutorials where I dive into kind of the internals of Meteor, Handlebars, and some other basically technologies that I think are interesting. So what we're going to do tonight is we're going to walk through the Meteor rendering process. And specifically, we're going to look at Spark, if you've heard of that. Have you guys seen the Spark documentation? Have you tried to look at it? I have. I'm going to tell you about that experience in a second. But also live ranges, and just sort of how does HTML end up on the DOM, and then what do we do with it once it's on the DOM. So let me tell you a second, I guess, about what I'm about. So there was always people, you know, in the computer science program or in life that seemed to be like geniuses at reading documentation and textbooks. I'm not that guy. I've always had trouble with this. And this is sort of just to give you an idea of just kind of my experience reading the documentation. It goes something like this. Can you guys read this? Who's seen this, by the way? So it goes something like, you could think of, so I start here, and it's like, okay, you could think of Spark as a declarative version of jQuery. jQuery is imperative, okay. To get work done in jQuery, you tell it to carry out a series of actions, and then you tell it what, and then I'm literally taking a fucking nap. Right? Like I just literally the power that this framework has over me is that I can't even get down to this point, like the main entry point, which theoretically is where you're supposed to learn how this works. Like I get to this paragraph and I went to sleep. So I wake up and I'm like, okay. Like there has to be a better way, right? Like I can't nap my way through learning this framework. And that's generally my experience in life. Like I take a lot of naps. And so, you know, reading the documentation is not going to work for me. And maybe some of you can relate. Going through the source code is the next best step, and so I did that. The problem with going through the source code is that the brain is only good at holding so much. So if I've been drinking, you know, like I have tonight, I have maybe, say, 3 or 4 registers where I can hold information, right, in my head. Like one of those pieces can be the actual execution environment. So as I'm reading the code, like I'm running it. Most of the time I have one register, which requires that I essentially have to prod and poke at the code to understand what it's doing. And so to understand Spark, my methodology was to essentially just beat it with a stick mercilessly until I got it to do something weird and react to those changes. So write functions against it, try and break it, and basically smash it onto the ground like a child. So I've taken some of those functions, and I've sort of turned them into a presentation. I'm going to walk through how this rendering process works. So I think the place to start is to turn off this pen. This is like an experiment. I do this on camera, but like doing it live is a whole different experience. So we're going to see if I can draw a little bit, but it might be difficult. We're also going to test my TMUX skills. Okay, so what I want to do is, you know, on the left, I actually have a Rails application that's running in the background. And for those of you who are sensitive about this kind of thing, my point is not to compare Rails and Meteor. I love Rails, but I also love Meteor. The point is just to look at how a traditional web application works. So if I do a curl request with I so we can see the headers, and I say, let's look at a regular web response. Now, I've written a basic web application. And this web application does something simple. I couldn't even get to hello world. I just wrote hello. And yeah. This requires turning off the pen. All hell could break loose as a result of me doing this. But we're going to give it a go. Can you guys see? OK. So what I've done is I've just done a simple curl on a regular web app that's running in the background. I've put it on port 8080 so I can have a Meteor app running as well. So what you see is we hit the server, and what comes back is a bunch of normal headers that we might expect, like the fact that the content type we're getting back is text HTML, and then some other garbage, and then we get HTML. And in that HTML, we have a header section, and you might do something like include a script, like jQuery. And then we have our HTML with a div tag and a hello world. Or not even a hello world, a hello string, right? And so the browser gets this HTML back, and it knows what to do with it because it parses it, and it turns it into something called a DOM tree. So everyone know what a DOM is? So I'm going to say this like a lot, so hopefully it's OK. So it takes this string, and it essentially parses it, turns it into a DOM, and then we can work with it in JavaScript. So interestingly, if you pop over to Meteor, and we do the same thing, we get back something different. So we get back a ton of JavaScript up here, but then in the body it's empty. There's nothing there. So the question is that we'd like to answer in the next 15 minutes or so is, how do we get HTML onto the page? What's that process look like? So that's the first question we're going to answer. And we're going to look at templates and how we use templates to do that. But then secondly is, how do we actually attach functionality to that HTML? And so functionality might be events. It might be reactivity, so the ability for the HTML to change dynamically because of reactive data sources. It might be some custom functionality that we want to add. And to do that, we're going to look at live ranges, and we're going to look at something called Spark, which is the underlying rendering engine for Meteor. So what I want to do next is, if anyone has any questions during this, just keep it to yourself. That would be great. And then ask at the end. This is like very serious for me. Like I'm going to go right through it, and then you can ask. Like this is only going to come out once. OK. So what we have is I want to go over, and here's my Meteor app. I mean, I wasn't joking. It literally just says hello. But if we look at the code for that Meteor app over on the right, we have one template in the body here, and it's called hello. And in hello, I render this div tag with some text in the middle. And over on the left, I have some template functions and a bunch of other garbage that you should ignore. But if you focus in on the middle part, just like in the apps that you've written, I'm sure yourselves, you have your helper functions, and that's where we return. I was going to do something cool with session. I figured out that I don't have time to do that. So basically, this just returns a string called hello. And then I have an event handler on this called click. And that just increases the font size so we can get a sense of what's happening. So when I click on this, it gets bigger. OK, so to beat Spark in live range with this stick, what I want to do is I want to break Meteor. So to break Meteor, what I'm going to do is I'm going to stop rendering this to the body. And I want to actually manually walk through what's happening. So we have a template here called hello, and it has some HTML in it. So the first thing we want to look at is what actually happens in JavaScript. What does this look like? Can we interrogate this, and can we play with it? So, thanks to hot code push, everything is refreshed. So the first thing we want to look at is we have these things called Handlebars Functions. Just raise your hand quickly if you know what Handlebars is and you're really familiar with it. OK, so I'm not going to spend a ton of time on it then. You know that Handlebars essentially takes HTML, compiles it into a function. So it takes one form and changes it into this function, and that function is callable. So we can actually do the same thing with a Meteor template, right? And if I type template, we can get a look at all these template functions that have been created. like this hello template function. If I call that function, we get back this string of HTML. Can you guys see that? And if I look at that function, I see all of this. So one question is, well, this function returns this string that we just looked at. So one question is, well, how does that string get onto the DOM? Well, let's do that manually in a second. But also the fact that this function seems to have a lot of stuff in it. We have spark.labelBranch, we have a create landmark, and then a bunch of other stuff. And then seemingly somewhere at the bottom, we return this HTML. So if we wanted to, what we could do is we could say HTML is equal to template.hello. And we've assigned this string now to this variable called HTML. And we know that we can do document.body.appendChild, but that's going to expect a document fragment. And right now we have a string. So what we need to do is we need to convert the string into a document fragment. And the way we're going to do that is there's a library that the Meteor team has written called DomUtils. And it has a method called HTML to fragment. And it's going to take a string as a parameter. So I'm going to pass that in. And I get back this document fragment that then gets appended to the document object model. And it shows up on the screen. You guys with me? So we haven't done anything interesting here, though. Like, for example, if I click on this, the event handlers aren't attached. So we've just taken this string of HTML, we've turned it into a document fragment, and we've just appended it to the body. And what we want to do with Spark and with live ranges is we want to actually attach functionality. And so the next step of this process is to kind of take a look at what's happening there. Now, this is actually pretty complicated, I think, to fit into a 10-minute segment, but I'm going to try. Before we look at some code, let me just kind of verbalize it, and then we'll go through it. So it turns out there's which I found, by the way, literally by beating this with a stick, as you know, there's a two-step process that's happening here. The first process is that we're taking some regular HTML that we would get back from calling a handlebars function, and we're annotating it. And what does that mean? It means we're actually creating some HTML that you'll never see in the DOM. That if the only way to see it is if you call the function and you see the string that gets returned is this annotated HTML. We're going to look at it in a second. And then what Spark is going to do is it's going to parse that annotated HTML and call functions for each annotation that it calls, that it finds. And when it sees like an annotation like events or like isolate, it's going to call a function. It's going to give us an opportunity to do something like attach functionality. And then the result of all of that is it's going to return a document fragment. So if that was too much to keep in your registers, let's just walk through it step by step. So here we're going to test my console skills. And I've created this function that I've named Destroy Magic. And before we get too far, what I want to do is go into that function and take a look at what's happening. So in Destroy Magic, you know what? We're actually not going to look at that function because it's ridiculous. So what we're going to do is we're going to look at this hello template. Okay. You guys didn't actually like log that to memory, right? It was really bad. All right. So I have this function called hello template. So I want you to think of this hello template function as very similar to calling template.hello and just getting that string of HTML back. The only difference is I've written a wrapper. And it's a wrapper around some stuff that we'll look at. So if you look in the documentation and you see spark.annotate or like spark.attach events or what it's doing is these are called annotation functions. And what these annotation functions are doing, and here I've created a custom one called log annotations so that we can visualize this. And what I'm doing is I'm passing it a function. So remember the templates that we see in HTML, they get compiled. This string on the right-hand side gets compiled into a function, and I'm passing that function as a first parameter to this function called log annotations. And if I look at log annotations, this is kind of like my custom annotation function. So you could think of this as something like spark.attach events or spark.isolate. It's very similar. If you looked at the source, this is essentially what it would look like. And what these Spark annotation functions will do is they're going to take a function as a parameter. Then what they're going to do is they're going to get this thing called a renderer. They're going to create a function called onMaterialize. And onMaterialize it's a callback function that will do something. In this case, our callback function is going to call this thing called print materialization, which is going to do something neat, and I'll show you. But here's two interesting parts. One is that if there's no renderer, like for example, remember when we just called template.hello and we just got a string back? I didn't create any kind of renderer or anything. I just called the function directly. Well, it's smart enough to just return the HTML. So in this case, it's just going to call the function, HTML function, and I get back this string of HTML. But if there is a renderer, I'm going to do something special. And that special thing I'm going to do is I'm going to call the Annotate method on the renderer. And as a first parameter to that annotation function, to this Annotate method, I'm going to pass the function that's going to return some HTML. So you can think of that as your Handlebars template or whatever it is. It could be a custom function if you wanted it to be. Then I'm going to pass the name of the annotation. And then I'm going to pass this function as a callback. So everyone knows what a callback is, I assume? So in a callback, I've just called it onMaterialize. And in that onMaterialize method, some magic is going to happen underneath where this thing called a live range is going to get created, and it's going to be passed as a parameter. And you could think of a live range as a handle to the HTML. We're actually going to visualize it in a second, but I can do things with the live range. I can manipulate the HTML. I can change it. I can attach properties to it. So this is a bit too much in verbalization, but I wanted you to have kind of a mental model of what an annotation function looks like. And now I think the thing to do is to just visualize it. So I've written some functions to help us do that. And we're going to start off by just looking at what an annotated HTML string looks like. OK, so nothing on the DOM. You can see that I haven't actually put anything on the screen yet. We'll do that in a second. But the first phase is just to call the handlebars template function. Now I'm cheating a bit here. I'm actually calling the Meteor template, but I haven't created a renderer yet. And so what it returns is just this string of HTML, like this. Then the second phase is to annotate the HTML. And to do that, I'm going to destroy magic. And we're going to go to the second phase. And this is what annotated HTML looks like. Has anyone ever seen this kind of representation of the HTML? Has anyone dug in and looked at what annotated HTML means or looks like? No? OK, thank goodness. So this is new. OK, so the thing to look at here is in the middle of all of this, what we have is our HTML string. Where did that come from? Up here. So we called our HTML function. In this case, it could be a handlebars template function. It could be a Jade function. It could be whatever you want. It could be your own function. And it's right in the middle. And then all around that, we have these tags that you never see, but they look kind of like HTML tags, don't they? And so we have something called isolate. We have something called watch, events, and so on. And then in the outermost one, we have something called logger, which is what I wrote. So it's a custom annotation so that we can see things like this. So can anyone think, by the way, of why it's a good idea to do this? Why separate this process into creating a string of annotated HTML and then parsing that string and running a bunch of materialization functions? Can anyone think of why that would be a good idea? This is a good test. It's whether people are falling asleep and taking a nap. No? Well, I can think of one. I don't know. I'm guessing. But I think one good reason is that you can run this on the server, right? So you could just run this function on the server, get a string of HTML, and then send it to the client, and then actually do the materialization process on the client, which is really powerful. It's really an interesting design concept. And so we can actually run this on the client. We can run it on the server. It's really, I think, a brilliant way to do it. So if we destroy magic number 3, I've written this amazing function. You know how long it took me to write this? It took 9 months to write this function. But basically what it does is it allows us, I thought, is this a good use of time? I don't know. But then 9 months went by and I was all right, well, I may as well show it off. This actually shows what happens in the materialization function. So in phase 3, what we're doing is, imagine what does this DOM tree look like sort of in code, in memory, behind the scenes. Well, one way to do that, by the way, before I get into this, like, how did I beat this with a stick? Well, if you click on this DOM node, you can actually get some intuition about what's happening by just going over in the debugger and clicking on the node itself and seeing that there's this strange Spark. There's actually a property that's been attached, an expando property it's called, to the DOM element. So like this thing in JavaScript in DOM notation, we can add properties to it, right? And one of those properties is this weird Spark with some esoteric tag, and then we have an array. So by the way, like if you're trying to figure this out just by looking at these arrays, like what do you see? You see a bunch of live ranges. I'm not sure what that is. Like this one says label, and then we have data and a bunch of other things. But the question is, like, what is this doing, right? Like, why is this important? So keep that in mind, and let's come back down here. So what does this actually look like if you put together this jigsaw puzzle and visualize what it's doing? It actually looks just like an HTML DOM tree. So down here, what I've done is I've created a function that actually goes through this live range using one of the methods that it has called operate, or actually called visit, and I've printed it out. One second, let me just, can I zoom this out just a bit? Can you guys still see that? Yeah, that's fine, right? Okay, so up in the top, what we have is we actually have a tree of HTML, right? So up here we have this div, and then we have hello. And down here we actually have a tree of HTML. It's just not, we just don't see it. So way down in here, what you're seeing is we have this HTML node. This is our div, right? And then in between, we have something called a text node. So we have the HTML text node, and that's this hello string right here. So if you were to traverse this in the DOM, you would see that you have a text node, and that text node's value is hello. But then all around that, we have these other tags. So by the way, in case that's not sinking in, like think of this as literally this is the div tag, and this is our text, right? And around all of that, like in the DOM, we have these other tags. They're invisible. You just can't see them. But if you go over in the properties, you can see how it was kind of magically inserted into the DOM. And those tags are called live ranges. And so when you look at the live range, like the first one that we have here is called isolate. So everyone familiar with reactivity, I would assume at this point. Well, one of the things that we get from this is the ability to, if some reactive data source changes, we're going to re-render this part of the HTML, right? So how do we do that? Well, I'm not going to go into that tonight, but it turns out that it's a materialization function that gets called. This live range gets sort of stored away. And if that data source changes, we see this HTML, we re-render it. We take it off the DOM, we change it, we put it back on the DOM using some pretty sophisticated algorithms. And around that, we have something called watch. Around that, something called events. And then we have this landmark, which is now getting much closer to what you manipulate in your template instances. So when we do callbacks, for example, the rendered callback or the created callback, that's essentially a thin wrapper around this landmark annotation. And there's landmark live range. And then we have some other things like labels and data. And so what we can do with this is, let me see, are there any other destroy magic? I don't think so. I think that's it. That's what you get. Okay. So what we can do with this is we can cause these live ranges to get created and added to the DOM using a method called spark.render, which is ultimately what's happening under the covers when the page first loads and that body is empty, is if you actually look at the source, which if we have time, we'll look at it. What I'm going to do here is I'm going to say fragment is equal to spark.render, and then I'm going to call this actual function, so template.hello, and I get back this document fragment. And I'm going to do something else here. I'm going to say document.body.appendChild, and I'm just going to say that same thing again. And I think it's already on the DOM, so we'll probably see it twice. And it's actually gone through. It's created those live ranges, but it's actually attached the functionality like event handlers. And so if we go into the div property here, we can see that actually the live ranges have been attached to the DOM. And if I were to grab one of these live ranges, I could call its methods, and I could traverse the live ranges and the HTML DOM just like it was a regular DOM node. You just don't see it. And so a couple points about this. Like, why is this kind of really important, right? Well, one reason is that in our templates, like how would you do this in jQuery? Well, you need to have some kind of container node, right? Like you'd have to put a div tag around your HTML and say, okay, this div tag is going to be my container. And so when I want to go and change it, what I'm going to do is I'm going to grab that div tag and then change whatever its contents are. But the templates that we have here are actually a lot more powerful, right? What I can do is I don't need to have any div tag, right? I can just have text. I don't have time, so let me just type world. Let's see. Right. And then what we'll do is just get rid of this and let Meteor do what it does. Okay, and if we look at this HTML, there's no div tags here, right? But actually, in kind of behind the scenes, what you can't see is there's this entire live range tree around each one of those text nodes, even though there's no div tag. And so if we actually click on one, we can see that, right, through this weird array structure. So we're running out of time, and I wanted to leave a little bit of time for questions. But my hope in going through this was we could have gone through those annotation functions in detail, but I think actually you can look at the source now, and when you see spark.isolate, you can actually see what it's doing and like how we're attaching functionality to the DOM and then grabbing it later and keeping track of where DOM nodes go and all that kind of stuff. So when you read the Spark reference material or the documentation, you don't have to take a nap. You can just basically dive into the source. And before we actually go to questions, what I want to do is I'm good at beating things with a stick. That's my kind of skill set. But it actually takes, I think, quite a gifted mind to come up with something like this. I think the design is pretty brilliant. And that person is David Greenspan. And so I'd like David to stand up and people to give him a round of applause. He's also a really nice guy, so you should just go up and talk to him and ask him any questions that you have. Okay, I think my time is up. Maybe 2 questions, 3 questions, or 0 questions. And then I'm not going to be hanging around. We have something else. But if you want to email me, I'm generally pretty friendly. So please do that. And also, I explain all of the annotation functions in detail in videos on eventedmind.com, so you can go check that out. If I can manage to get this back on the screen. Any thoughts or questions? Really exciting bunch.
When's your next video coming out?
Oh, I don't know. I need to think it through. Probably within a week or 2. Can you speak up? I'm sorry, I can't hear you.
These things were down before while your first one using this.
Okay, I gotta walk over there with my beer. Sorry. So by me, I assume you mean the Meteor team. I could let them answer that question, but I'm just going to answer it and then move on. My answer is, I think the reason I think this is a pretty brilliant solution is because there's a lot of problems that haven't been solved yet that really needed to get solved in order to create a really flexible, thick client where you don't have to think about it. You can just write your templates. You don't have to worry about the DOM too much. And one of those problems was the fact that you need to be able to keep track of ranges of HTML without having to enclose them in div tags. And so how might you go about doing that? There's probably a number of different ways. I think this one seems to work pretty well. In my experience, have never seen another approach like this, but I could definitely be wrong. It's certainly a little bit different from jQuery, right? A lot different. Or different from Ember, or different from Handlebars. Like generally, you put something on the DOM, it's on there, and then you attach stuff to it afterwards. like you say, jQuery $, div.on click, and then you attach. And in this case, you're actually just sort of declaratively saying what you want it to do, and the Meteor just takes care of it. And I think one of the key benefits of that is you can do it on the client, you can do it on the server. It's fine. Like actually, right now, the materialization and annotation processes are combined, but my presumption is that the idea originally was to be able to separate them. So otherwise, why would they do it other than, tech porn? I can't think of any other reason. So, yeah.
Pretty awesome. Thanks for doing that presentation and spending everyone's.
That function was pretty gnarly.
But it's sort of internal, right? It's great to look at it, but you want to start using those things for your own application because they can change at any time. They're not in the documentation, right? I mean, would you think that building an application using Spark itself is safe, or?
Well, I can give you. So I think there's two questions there. One. So how is the documentation? I think actually, I went back and when I think about this honestly, I think the documentation is very good, actually. I think it's been well done. Like when I go back and I look at the Spark afterwards, like after I've beat this with a stick, I'm like, oh yeah, this is right. Like it's precisely right. The problem is that there's a lot of concepts like, especially if you're coming from Rails or something, that there's no association to be made, right? So I think that on the learning front of this, it helps just to be able to see it, and documentation is not going to be able to really accomplish that. I think the second question was, can you actually use these functions? Like, can you create them? And is it safe? Well, there's a package out there. I think if you're a package author, like I wrote something called Mini Pages. It's one of the two router projects that are out there. Tom's Meteor.router is the other one. And by the way, we're talking about merging those at some point, so it's not so confusing. But I really had to understand how Spark worked. And actually, I released Mini Pages without understanding how Spark worked. And then I got a bunch of bug reports. So I was like, OK, now it's time to take the 9 months. It wasn't really 9 months. It was like a weekend. It felt like 9 months. But the point was, like, it actually allowed me to do something really neat. And that was, instead of just replacing the entire body with, like, the new route that's being rendered, I can just actually render an empty thing, right? And say, like, when the template changes or the route changes, just re-render this one part of the page. And that allows you to do some really neat things. Like, for example, you can say the layout doesn't actually ever re-render. Like, you can say, my toolbar, just leave it alone. It's not changing. Just re-render the child part. And I do that by creating a yield handlebars helper on the fly and all that kind of stuff. But I would have felt awkward releasing something like that. Well, obviously I didn't feel that awkward. I released it. But I felt awkward for a couple weeks, and then I think I really needed to understand Spark to make it really good. So this was a long-winded way of saying I don't think you need to understand Spark or live ranges to be productive in Meteor. I think that there are actually quite a bit of interesting use cases for creating your own live ranges. Meteor has not gone out of their way to expose that in a nice way. I suspect that they're thinking about it. So, I don't know, does that answer your question? Yeah, sure.
No, I would just be worried when you spend a lot of time building an application and you made this assumption about this, something that Spark does, and maybe it changes because I don't know what the difference is in the documentation on docs.meteor.com versus on the GitHub wiki. How likely it is to change?
Well, here's what I would expect to change, right? I would expect method names to change. I would expect that, when I call _.renderer, that maybe, in a couple months they call it getRenderer or whatever, right? Do I expect like the fundamental idea of live ranges and annotated HTML to change? No, I mean, I expect if I had to envision how this brainstorming session went, is it took months, maybe years of context to build up that idea, right? So, I mean, yeah, we'll get some method changes, things like that, but I doubt the concepts will change. The Meteor team can cut me off at some point if they want. Preferably not.
It probably also helps with debugging. You get some Spark errors, and sometimes they don't make sense. So understanding how Spark works,
yeah, absolutely.
Helps a lot.
Like parent not found and all that nonsense. Yeah.
I would
David.
say that, this is pre 1.0. This is pre 1.0, guys are going to change in Spark, make them more internal, less, used by application APIs to change at a higher rate. But on the other hand, there's stuff you can do today only by using these internal Spark APIs. And if they do change, they will change similar or similarly principled Yeah, all this stuff is subject to change. That doesn't mean it's necessarily something bad.
But in the meantime, like, why not go beat live range with a stick? It's fun. I mean, just go in and like try different things and see if you come up with something neat, right? I mean, it might be, like, for example, one thing I can think of is we need better debugging tools for this framework. Yeah, I mean, someone ought to go in and write a logger annotation so that we can visualize what's happening. Someone ought to write something which called reactive vision that I wrote last week, actually, and might release. That actually goes through and logs all the reactive changes, and so that you can see which templates have been re-rendered and like all that kind of stuff. But all right, any other questions?
So as you were talking, I was thinking that one use of an annotation might be to add some data from an external library. Like, this is what I'm going to talk about soon, but I was wondering if that would be, I hadn't thought of this until just now when you were presenting, and the idea that maybe you could take like something that jQuery normally stores, like a .data or an expando attribute of some sort, and put that into a Spark annotation so that you can maintain the reactivity.
Maybe.
I don't know.
That's an interesting thought experiment.
I'd like to see the logger thing more.
Yeah, well, it's actually, I managed to commit it. You know what I'm going to do? I'm going to throw it up on Atmosphere, probably in the next couple of days, so you guys can play with it. Any other questions? Don't be shy. All right, well, I really appreciate you taking the time, and this was fun. So please email me and say hello, and if you have any ideas for things or questioning about how the internals work. I've pretty much been in and out of the source code, so hopefully I can answer some of the questions. And have a good night.